started talking about the book of Ruth, I suggested that as we read this story, that we read it not only as a happily ever after story, which it is, but also through the lens of protest literature. Protest literature with the theme of Hesed. Last week in the story of Ruth, as we talked about it, we talked a little bit about the setting of Ruth. And the setting of Ruth is one that is probably a little different from when it was written. The setting is from the time of Judges in the land of Israel, but it is my opinion that it was written sometime well after that. And of course, you are welcome to disagree with me. I got no problem with that. But I think it was probably written sometime in the post-exilic period. So that means that this is the time when the Jews are coming back home from Babylonian captivity. They have been gone for years. When they come back home, they are going through an attempt of rebuilding. Rebuilding a community, rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding a people. And part of that rebuilding program was a focus on the purity of the Jewish people. The leadership of the Jews were pretty much against foreigners at this time, shunning foreigners even to the point that the leadership encouraged men who were married to foreigners to divorce them, to kick them out of the community. And so we have a time in the life of the people of Israel where they are very suspicious of foreigners and don't want them in their land at all. And so here we have this story of Ruth, who is a foreigner. She is a foreigner from a foreign land, and she comes into the place of bread, Bethlehem, where the harvest is going on. And there she meets a man of good standing in the community, Boaz, a good Jewish man of the family of, can you say it again, David? Elimelech. And a man of good standing and of prosperity. And not only do they meet, but they get married, and here's a spoiler alert, they have a child. And that child becomes the grandfather of King David.
I knew it!
Good job, Mason. So in a time when people were very suspicious of foreigners and didn't think that foreigners would help with the rebuilding of the Jewish people, we have a story about a foreigner who is the great-grandmother of arguably the greatest king in Jewish history. So not only is it a protest against the exclusivity of the Jewish people against the foreigners at the time, it is also a protest against a male-dominated society. Remember, this was a patriarchal society. Men were in charge. They were the leaders, no doubt about it. But here we have a story about two main characters whose names are Ruth and Naomi. And the book is titled Ruth. I mean, they could have easily called it Boaz. We talked last week about how that's a really good name. It means strength. But they didn't. The name of the story is Ruth. And Ruth is the one who expresses Hesed. Hesed is a Hebrew word which means loving kindness. In particular, when we are talking about loving kindness, we are talking about God's loving kindness, God's enduring devotion to God's people. And it is very easily summed up in the line that Ruth pledges to her mother-in-law. Where you go, I go. Where you live, I live. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Loving kindness, devotion, Hesed. And it is exemplified from this woman, this foreigner, who was probably, or should have been, maybe shunned from that community. So it is my suggestion that as we read this story of Ruth, we read it through the lens of protest literature with a focus on Hesed. In today's reading, that again, great job, David. In today's reading, Ruth's foreignness and her gender are placed at the forefront of the story. In this one chapter that David read, and I'm sure y'all probably weren't keeping up with this, but in this one chapter, 7 times is Ruth's foreignness mentioned. Not only is it mentioned 7 times, but one time it's mentioned right on top of itself. If you recall, when Boaz comes to the field and inquires about her, his lead servant says, "Oh, that's the Moabite woman from Moab." That would be like if I said, "Hey guys, it's Doyle Reed, the Texan from Texas." We would already know that from his boots and hat, but still, we really want to know, or the narrator really wants us to know, that Ruth is anything but Jewish. The servant wants to make sure that Boaz knows that this woman is not Jewish. She is a foreigner. One of these things does not belong, Boaz, and it is Ruth, the Moabite from Moab. Now, if you've done study about this little section of Ruth, you know that it was kind of customary in those times, and according to Torah, according to law, that when the harvest was going on, when people were reaping in the harvest, the things that got left over, the poor, the widow, the orphans, the resident aliens, could come behind and they could glean whatever little bits of grain were left over. I grew up in Shreveport area, and most of my family were cotton farmers. And I grew up in a time when during the cotton harvest they actually used big machines to harvest the cotton. And no matter how many times those machines went down the rows of cotton, there was always cotton left on the plant. And I said something to my uncle about this one time, and he said, "Oh, it's not as much as you would think it is." That was the gleanings that these people had to pick from. Do you get the picture? Now again, according to law, that's what the poor were supposed to be able to do. But it is possible that Ruth was not supposed to be doing that according to the law. It is for the widows and the orphans. Those are Jewish widows and orphans, by the way, and the resident alien. A resident alien was generally described as someone who was a man and who had lived within the community for quite some time. I don't know if y'all been keeping up with Ruth, but she doesn't fit either of those characteristics. She is a woman, and she has not been there for very long at all. So it is quite possible that she was not supposed to be allowed to glean from this field. But there she is in this communal field, in the section that belongs to Boaz, and Boaz not only lets her glean from his field, so probably breaking the law, but then tells his servants to put out a little extra for her on top of that. The protest against exclusivity, against shunning foreigners, it's right here, again. And then Boaz goes on to say to Ruth, make sure and stay with my people, because he says he has instructed others to not bother her. Now, we're not really sure what that means when he says for the young men not to bother her. It could be a sexual connotation, or it might just be that he knows they're going to pick on her and bully her because she is not like anyone else. But for whatever reason, it seems to be that she needs protection. Probably because of her foreignness, probably because she wasn't supposed to be there. Protest. But the icing on the cake, the one that really jumps out at me, is when Ruth is shocked. She is shocked by being allowed to do this. And she even asks Boaz why he has been so kind to her and allowed her to do so much. She says, "I, a foreigner, why have you done this for me?" And he says to her, "It has been told to me what you have done for Naomi, how you left behind your father and your mother and your people to go to a land that you did not know." I don't know what that makes you all think of, but it reminds me of Genesis, when God says to Abraham, "Go, leave your father's family, your home. Go to a land that I will show you." And in Hebrews, we are told that Abraham, by faith, went to a land that he did not know. I don't know if the narrator of Ruth is trying to make that parallel with Abraham. I don't know if Boaz was trying to tell Ruth that she was like Abraham, but to me, that seems very obvious. All of this foreigner, is suddenly being accepted. despite the laws and the customs Boaz has accepted her in, has given her extra and possibly even compared her to Father Abraham, the ancestor of the faith. Protest against exclusivity? Maybe. That's her foreignness that's on show. Her gender is also at the forefront of what's going on here. At the very beginning, Ruth is talking to Naomi, and Naomi calls her daughter. So we know right then, in case we had forgotten, this is a woman. And did you catch on to the place that she holds in society when Boaz sees her? When Boaz sees her in the field, he comes to his head servant and he says to her, to whom, or to his servant, to whom does that woman belong? Did you catch that? To whom does that woman belong? He doesn't say, hey, who is that? Let me say, who is she? To whom does that woman belong? We know at this point in the story, if there was any doubt before now, that the men are supposed to be in charge, that the women are just property to the men. To whom does that woman belong? The servant tells him then about Ruth. Remember the Moabite from Moab? But even though she is a woman who has lesser standing in that society, we are told that she is exceptional. The servant praises Ruth because she has been here since morning, working and gleaning on her feet this whole time and has not yet had a break. Exclamation point. If it's not there, it should be. Exclamation point. He was impressed by this woman's exceptional ethic, exceptional attitude, exceptional work habits. And then Boaz goes on to say to her, remember that bit about it has been told to me what you have been doing for your mother-in-law Naomi since you have come back here? That also is exceptional. If you remember back in the first chapter, the reason that we call Ruth the daughter-in-law of Naomi is that Ruth was married to the son, one of the sons of Naomi. Well, Naomi's husband died. She became a widow. When she became a widow, her sons and her sons' families were supposed to take care of her. But her sons died. There were no children in that family, so those families no longer existed. At this point, Naomi had no support system. Her support system were supposed to be her people, the Jews, back in Bethlehem. That's why she went back there. They were supposed to take care of her. But they didn't. Ruth did. Ruth took care of her ex-mother-in-law. It wasn't required of her. It wasn't the law that said you have to take care of this woman anymore. In fact, the law and the custom said she's got to take care of herself. You got to take care of yourself. The law and the custom of the time would have told Ruth, you need to go out and find yourself a new husband. That's the only thing you need to be worried about right now. But instead, she does what no one else was doing. She takes care of Naomi. So, even though she is a woman in this patriarchal society who is seen as property, we know from the story that she is exceptional. And she is doing all that she can to care for this woman who she has made her family, despite the cost, despite the laws, despite the customs of that time. Why did she do that? Because this is the woman to whom she said, where you go, I go. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Loving kindness. Hesed. So the book of Ruth. Protest literature for that day. But I think it's protest literature for today, too. We have a story of a woman, a story of an immigrant, who left a land that took her husband and could no longer provide for her. And so she went to a better land. And she went there with a family she was trying desperately to keep together. Despite the cost, despite the laws, despite the customs, that's what she was doing. She did it because of Hesed. Because of her loving kindness, her devotion, her loyalty. The same loving kindness, the same Hesed that God has for God's people. This was protest literature in the ancient days. Whether it was written during the time of Judges, when foreigners weren't really liked much then either, or whether it was written during the time of the post-exile when they really didn't like foreigners, this was a protest against that exclusivity. This was a protest against leadership that was supposed to be only for men. It was a protest in those ancient days. It was set in that ancient time. But it is more than protest for ancient times. It is protest literature that is timeless. And it is quite possible that this is protest literature that is timely for today.